It is my great pleasure to introduce Don and Petie Kladstrup. I guess you can hear me? Authors of the amazing book, Wine and War. After reading the book when it was first published, along with being an extremely interesting story, my husband and I realized we had met Bernard Denoncourt and his wife many years before through mutual friends. At the time, of course, we had no idea what he and his family had lived through. After a bit of sleuthing and an unsuccessful year of first trying to reach the Kladstrups through their publisher, John Whitehead, another one of our French heritage speakers and a friend, was able to find their information for us. Don and Petie Kladstrup are authors of two best-selling books, the first being Wine and War, the French, the Nazis, and the Battle for France's Greatest Treasure, a bestseller that has been optioned for a motion picture. Their second book deals with World War I, Champagne, How the World's Most Glamorous Wine Triumphed Over War in Hard Times. And both books have been translated into more than a dozen languages. Their third book, Champagne Charlie, the Frenchman who taught America to love champagne, will be released in November. Both authors are former journalists. Don was a foreign correspondent for CBS and ABC television news, where he won 3 Emmys and numerous other awards. Petie, an Overseas Press Club award winner, worked for several Midwestern newspapers before serving as an assistant to the American ambassador of UNESCO in Paris. They are longtime residents of Paris and are the parents of 2 adult daughters. In the small world category, after rereading the book again, I realized that 2 of our French heritage friends have family involved in the story. French Heritage board member and friend Sarah Delançon's mother-in-law, Marie-Eliane Delançon, is the author of the diary, which is referred to in the book. A previous French Heritage speaker and friend, Alexandre de Vogüé, whose family owns Vaux-le-Vicomte, is related to 3 of the de Vogüé gentlemen in the book. Even one of our authors, Petie Kladstrup, was a former volunteer with Vieille Maison Française in Paris, who worked with French Heritage founder Michel de Ministrel. It's a very small world indeed. The Kladstrups will now tell you all about all of that and so much more. Don and Petie Kladstrup.
Okay. Oh, let's see. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Jean. That was a very generous and gracious introduction. And Don and I are absolutely thrilled to be here to be doing this for you for all of the reasons Jean cited, but also because the story was one that we really enjoyed telling, especially as so many people had said to us, nobody's going to talk to us. Nobody will be willing to discuss this period of time, the war period. Collaboration still hangs over France like a dark cloud. So it was a real pleasure for us to meet people who, in fact, were willing to talk to us. And we feel very fortunate to have met them, and especially at the time we did, because since we've written the book, I think nearly everyone we spoke to during the course of our research has since passed away. The other thing that was particularly fortunate in doing the book was discovering just how important wine is to France, not just economically, because it does command 1/6 the economy of this country, but more in a way of the culture, how important it is to the culture of France. For instance, one person reminded us that the French government did a study a few years ago, a multi-volume study, I think it was 7 volumes, to try and determine what it is that makes the French French. They came up, well, I have to tell you that when we mentioned this to a group of French people and said this was a 7-volume study about them, one of them piped up immediately and said, "What? Only 7 volumes?" But yes, 7 volumes with 4 things that may really stand out. The first 3, I think you would guess. One, being born French, 2, speaking French, 3, being willing to fight for and defend liberty. But number 4 was knowing wine, and not just any wine, knowing and appreciating good wine. It's what defines us, one person said to us. It's what gives us wit, gaiety, and good taste, something that sets us remarkably apart from a nation of beer drinkers. Any idea who they were talking about?
I could make a good guess, yeah. But before we get into all that, why don't we get into how our book got launched, how we actually began, and let's see. Here we go. Okay, it really began with a guessing game, and with that man in a suit standing in the middle of his vineyard. His name was Gaston Huet, and he was the mayor of Vouvray, a little winemaking community in the Loire Valley. He was also one of France's greatest winemakers. We got to know him when I was doing some stories for CBS News in the area, stories about the French government's plans to send the new high-speed train roaring through that area, through tunnels that would be bored in the hills around there. Winemakers were up in arms. They feared that the vibrations from the trains running on the tracks would ruin their wine. And it was Hewitt who took up their cause, spearheaded their campaign to provide or try to prevent the government from going through with this project. He failed. He lost the battle, but he won our hearts because sometime later, he invited us to his place, his home. And we were sitting in his office one day, I remember, we're chatting about this and that. And all of a sudden, he got up from his chair, excused himself, and disappeared from the room. And, Petie and I looked at each other and we were wondering, what gives? What's going on here? A short time later, he returned, and he was carrying a bottle, and he had 3 glasses, and he began pouring. And as he poured wine into our glasses, almost immediately the entire office was filled with a bouquet of honey and apricots. And we knew we were about to taste something really good. And Hewitt said, "Go ahead, try it. But also, tell me when you think this wine was made." Well, it was wonderful. But we decided, okay, fine. We'll put out a few guesses. 1990, Hewitt shook his head. Well, how about 1980? Shook his head again, and he began to smile. We went backward in time again. 1970, 1965. He continued shaking his head no. And as he did, the smile just became wider and wider, almost like a Cheshire cat. We said, okay, look, we'll give it one more try. And then, you tell us. How about 1955? And he would, no way. And that grin could not have been bigger. So tell us, Gaston, when did this wine get made? He says, I made it in 1947. It's the greatest wine I have ever made. And we thought so many years back, 1947, this wine is so fresh and vibrant that, it tastes like it could have been made yesterday. But no, it was 1947. And I asked him, I said, have you ever tasted anything better than this? Anything more memorable? And all of a sudden, that smile on his face disappeared. He became somber, incredibly serious, almost sad. His mind went backward in time, and he said, yes, he says, it was when I was a prisoner of war in Germany. He said, the wine I had, it was really nothing special, and no more than a thimbleful, but it was the only wine I tasted in 5 long years of captivity. I will never forget it. It was absolutely glorious. And, Petie and I wondered, wine in a German POW camp? How could that be? How how many other stories like this are there out there? But it set us searching, and it was really what launched us into writing Wine and War, knocking on doors, interviewing people, telling really how winemakers survived during that terrible period.
One of the first places, one of the first doors we knocked on was in Burgundy, in Beaune, at Maison Joseph Drouin, where we met Robert Drouin, the man who was running the Maison Joseph Drouin at the time. And one of the things that Robert did wonderfully was to set a stage for us, to talk to us about what life was really like in those years leading up to the war. And one of the things he said to us was, time was told by the church bells. They were the background music to life in the vineyards. Now, Drouin was only a kid at the time, 8 years old, but he talked about how he and his father would go for walks in the vineyards nearly every day and stop for long, rambling conversations with the men who were working the vines. And as Robert said, people seem to have had more character back then. They never hesitated to tell my father what they thought or how they believed things should be done. And my father was always ready to listen. Those were the moments when I learned to love the vines.
Yeah, but all of that was about to change, because on May 9th, 1940, Hitler told his general staff, "Gentlemen, you're about to witness the most famous victory in history." The following day, German forces poured into France. And less than a month later, they were in Paris, marching down the Champs-Élysées. The takeover was complete. Many people had fled. There was hardly any resistance.
But these men had a goal, and that goal was the Tour d'Argent, their first stop as they marched into Paris, home of that famous restaurant, and its even more famous wine caves, where there were more than, I guess, 100,000 bottles at the time. However, unfortunately, Claude Terrail got there before the Germans did. Claude was a young man then, and he would take over the restaurant after the war from his father. But at the time, he was in the French Air Force, and he begged and pleaded for a pass to leave so he could get back when he knew the Germans were coming. He was granted 6 hours. It was a frantic 6 hours as he and the maître d' of the restaurant rushed to slap mortar onto bricks and build a wall to hide the most valuable bottles, the most precious bottles of all. They knew they couldn't get all of them hidden, but they managed to hide 20,000 behind that wall. So when the Germans came, the first words out of their mouths were, "We want to see your 1869 wines. We want those." And the maître d' looked at them rather blankly and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, those have all been drunk." They said, "Well, what do you mean? We know that we've been told they're here." And he said, "Well, no, but you can check if you'd like," which they liked. And so they descended into the caves.
That's right. They looked around. This 1869s were absent, but the Germans did cart off 80,000 bottles. They left the 20,000, which were hidden behind the wall, still in the restaurant. So, that was a good news story. However, the takeover of France happened so quickly that Hitler and his cronies really didn't have much time to work out a plan for an orderly occupation. In other words, there was no blueprint. And the result was 3 months of absolute, complete chaos. Wine cellars like this one were looted. Chateaus were overrun. Philippine de Rothschild of Chateau Mouton Rothschild told us how, as a young girl, she saw an old cook running around in the chateau, trying to get pictures off the walls, paintings, expensive ones, off the walls before German soldiers began shooting at them. Over at Chateau Coste d'Estournel, people who lived in the vicinity were suddenly awakened by the sound of bells ringing. Now, I don't know if you can see it, but around the towers there, you can see little bells hanging. And that's what the German soldiers were shooting at, target practice. I mean, it made quite a noise, we understand. Vineyards in the vicinity, they were turned into shooting ranges, even those around the chateau.
Yes, this gorgeous chateau, Pichon Longville, Comtesse de Lalande. You can see why the Germans quickly requisitioned it and moved in, but all the beautiful furniture, all the boiseries on the wall, the furniture chopped up, needed to heat the place, needed to keep warm. They made life very uncomfortable, not only for the Miai family who owned this chateau, but for everyone in the Bordeaux area. May Aliane de Lancasang, who maiden name was Miai, recalls the difficulties of the life they faced there, that the Germans had requisitioned so many things, including the horses they used to work the vineyards. What could they do? How could they manage to keep going? They hitched their cows to the plows and worked the vineyards that way. And May Aliane told us with great sadness, and those poor cows, and they had to give milk too.
Yeah, I'll never forget how she said that. I mean, it was I thought she was going to break into tears.
Yeah, it was obviously a really difficult time for the whole, not only for the Miai family, but for everyone. And it took several months before order was finally restored to the country, and that was done when the Germans decided to split the country in half. As you can see here, the unoccupied zone at the bottom there was left to Marshal Pétain and the Vichy government. But that yellow zone, the German occupation zone, was drawn very carefully, and they made sure that all the best vineyards of France remained in German control.
Yeah, because the war would end one day, and they saw all this, the wine production, the vineyards, is something of a golden goose, or a goose that would lay the golden egg, and provide great riches for the 1,000-year Reich that they foresaw.
So their goal was to hang on to those vineyards, but and to keep them healthy. At the same time, they wanted the wine. They wanted the wine for their own use. They wanted it for prestige. And so they decided that they would look into their own wine trade and send people from the German wine trade to take over.
But not yet. We've got to get to Mr. Garrett. Remember him? France, he told his troops, is fattened with such good food that it's shameful. He says, I want you to transform yourselves into a pack of hunting dogs and be on the lookout for what will be useful to Germany, especially its wine. And as you say,
and that's where they went to the wine trade in Germany to send what they thought would be, wine merchants in uniform. But that was where they made a terrible mistake. The men in the German wine trade were friends with the men in the French wine trade, and it was almost all men at that time. But they had worked together for generations. They trained in each other's businesses. They spoke each other's languages. They were godfathers to each other's children. So they were very, very aware that they would need to, once the war was over, that they would still need to do business. And so they had to do what they could to both preserve the business and yet satisfy the thirst of the Third Reich.
Yeah, it was kind of a double game that they played, satisfying their bosses in Berlin, protecting their friends in France.
Now, the most important but first of all, let me tell you that these wine merchants in uniforms, the French quickly came up with a name for them. They called them the Vineyards. And here is the most important one, the man on the left, Heinz Bomers. He was sent to oversee the Bordeaux vineyards, the Bordeaux wine production, the wine that would be the most valuable, the Germans thought, for financing the war and then for financing the next 1,000 years.
Yeah, they may have been called wine merchants in uniforms, but Bomers hated wearing the uniform. He hated the Nazis, and he especially hated Field Marshal Goering. When Goering ordered, you're looking at some very expensive bottles of Mouton Rothschild. Goering wanted a case of that, and so Bomers, called over to the chateau and he says, "Print up some labels for your wines." They did. He got the labels and he pasted them then on bottles of plonk, bottles of just wine that was little better than rubbish, and sent it off to the field marshal. If the field marshal noticed, there's no evidence of it.
And it was later when we were speaking with Philippine de Rothschild, who said that Heinz Bomers, that Weinführer, Heinz Bomers was the man who saved our wine.
Mm-hmm. But the French, didn't rely solely on the Weinführers for everything, and they actually took action themselves. And one of our chapters is called "Hiding, Fibbing, and Fobbing Off." For that's exactly what they did. Take the Drouin cellars, for instance, Robert Drouin's cellars. The family there constructed a fake wall and put their most precious stocks behind it. And afterwards, Robert and his sisters went around and tried to hunt up spiders, which they put on the walls, on the fake wall, to make it so they could spin cobwebs and make the wall appear much older than it actually was.
Instant aging they came up with.
Yep.
But others, like Johnny Hugo, and this is a picture of him in Alsace. They make fabulous wines, but they were not. Well, I should say they were not above cheating the Germans, and by doing so, they would, I guess, adulterate their wines. They would purposely misdirect their shipments. If the Germans said, send many cases to Hamburg, they'd send it off to Hamburg. They also had no hesitation about sending their worst wine, because as Johnny told us, the Germans weren't necessarily specific in their orders. They would merely say, send Riesling, didn't specify the vintage, didn't necessarily specify which one. And so they took advantage of that to send off the worst stuff they had around. And as Johnny said, if it hadn't been for those Germans, we'd still have that awful 39 in our cellars.
Yep. Meanwhile, the French resistance was at work. In the Loire Valley, for instance, they would ambush trains and siphon wine from cars. Chateau Loudun, that was a special place.
Yes, this really beautiful property. The Germans took a look at that nice pink facade and said, this will make a great brothel. You can imagine the owners were not thrilled, and the chatelaine, Madame, began running out to the barn immediately and collecting rat droppings, which she brought into the house and sprinkled around liberally, especially in the bedrooms. It was enough to put the Germans off and decide they'd find another locale for the brothel.
The German soldiers who were stationed in France, especially in Paris, thought that they were living like God. I mean, they were really having a good time. And when they went out to dinner or whatever, they would all obviously, arrive with their thirst and order bottles of wine, which, they thought, well, we're drinking something really special. But that wasn't always the case, because restaurant owners began gathering dust that had been collected from a carpet cleaning company called
Chevalier.
Chevalier,
Yeah.
right. And they would come back and then sprinkle bottles with this dust and make the Germans think that, hey, we're really drinking something special and something old.
Actually, they were getting very nice old dust.
Yeah.
Then that, however, was only a reflection of how much the French were working behind the scenes to try and and carry, well, to try and maintain their own way of life. But as one of the guys in the resistance told us, it was tricking the Germans was our favorite sport. It was almost like a game, but of course it was a very dangerous game they were playing. And the most dangerous place of all was in Champagne, where the wine Führer in charge was a man named Otto Klebisch. Klebisch was a real expert in champagne and a connoisseur. He could tell when somebody had doctored the champagne or someone had tried to foist something else onto him that wasn't really, really good champagne. So when one of the producers was caught providing faulty champagne, Klebisch hauled him into the office and yelled at him, how dare you try and foist this off on the Wehrmacht?
Yeah, fizzy ditch water, he called it.
Yeah, and the producer said, well, it's not as though it's going to be drunk by anybody who knows anything about champagne. That remark cost him a long time in prison.
Yep. Champagne makers were required to supply Germany with 2 million bottles of bubbly a month. And it was Klebisch's job to make sure that it happened. And this brings up another story that's probably worth telling. One day, the wine Führer called up Roger Hodez, who was secretary of the association representing major champagne houses, and invited him to his office for an aperitif. We've never had a drink together, so why don't you drop by my office and we'll have one, he said. Well, Hodez felt that, he couldn't refuse. Now, let me read you something from our book about what happened next, because, well, when Hodez arrived, Klebisch invited him to sit down, poured him a glass of champagne. Then he poured one for himself. The wine Führer seemed to be in a good mood, and Hodez began to relax. And then suddenly, Hodez's nose wrinkled as a ghastly odor rose from his glass. Bravely, he took a sip. The taste was only slightly better than the smell. There was no sign that Klebisch had noticed Hodez's discomfort. Well, what do you think? He asked affably. But before Hodez could reply, the wine Führer suddenly leaned across his desk, put his face just inches away from Hodez's, and said, "Let me tell you what I think," he snarled, his voice rising in crescendo. "It smells like shit. And this is what you want me to give to the Wehrmacht to drink? My God, I could be sent to the Russian front for that." Well, Hodez was just shaking. He was trembling in fear and saying, "I'm sure it was just an accident, maybe the result of dirty bottles." Well, before he could say anything more, Klebisch ordered him out of the office. But boy, it was a close call there.
It was also something that gave rise to an organization, a more solid organization of the champagne makers, which was put together by this man, Robert-Jean de Vogüé, who was head of Moet and who became the spokesman, the person who was representing the champagne industry to Klebisch to try and work out an amiable relationship. But Robert-Jean de Vogüé had a secret life. He was also the head of the political arm of the resistance in Champagne. Unfortunately, the Gestapo figured that out. So one day when Robert-Jean de Vogüé was in Klebisch's office with his assistant Claude Formon, they heard the phone ring. And a man came into the office, and another soldier came into the office and said to Klebisch, "Telephone call for you." Klebisch got up, went out, and was back in the office within mere minutes. "Gentlemen, that was the Gestapo, and you're under arrest." Almost immediately, the door opened and the armed members of the Gestapo burst in and carried Robert-Jean de Vogüé and Claude Formon off to prison.
Yep, they were thrown into prison. De Vogüé was sentenced to death. Formon was sentenced to a concentration camp.
He was sent to Bergen-Belsen.
Yeah, their arrests and the death sentence in particular caused an uproar in Champagne. Champagne producers went on strike. It was the first time that they'd ever done this. And as a result, the death sentence on Devogway was lifted. Instead, he was sent to a slave labor camp where he was expected to be worked to death, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
It was there that he discovered or realized that he had gangrene growing in one of his fingers and was in a desperate situation until he found a piece of glass and tried to sharpen it as much as he could, and finally amputated his own finger, which was the reason he was able to survive at all through these horrible years in prison or in the slave labor camp. But Formone too was suffering at Bergen-Belsen, as you can imagine. He was tortured. Every day was a test of survival, he said.
Mm-hmm. He would fix a date to live, and then when that date passed, he'd pick another. Those dates stretched on through the winter of 1943 and 44. The cold was unbearable, he told us. I sang against the cold. I sang hymns, children's songs, anything. Songs seemed to be the only thing that helped me. When Formone finally returned home, he, like Devogway, was barely alive. He'd been tortured and was no longer the ebullient young man whom the Gestapo had arrested 2 years earlier. I came back young. I came back not young anymore, he told us. He was 30 years old. Our book, however, does have a happy ending.
Right. It was after all these stories, the sadness and the horror of them, we were, I think, somewhat relieved to come across Bernard de Nonancourt and hear his stories, which were amazing. He was a young man, as all of these people were during the war, and a tank commander. When he finally was given the opportunity to, well, be part of a race, between the French and the Americans to get to Berchtesgaden, to Hitler's last redoubt. This is where all of the officers, all of the high command had their private chalets. But Hitler himself had a redoubt at the top of the Obersalzberg mountain, Eagle's Nest.
Yeah.
And it built for the last bunker, I guess. But by the time that de Nonancourt got there, the elevator that led up to Eagle's Nest had been destroyed with all of the bombings in the area. This was bad news because at this point, his commanding officer said, "Hey, Nonancourt, you're a boy from Champagne, aren't you? You must know something about wine. I hear there's a bunch up there. Why don't you go up and bring it down, and you guys can help yourself."
Yeah.
So de Nonancourt, of course, agreed, and then had the trauma of trying to figure out how the heck am I going to get up there, and even more difficult, how am I going to get that wine down?
Well, what he did was grab a bunch of mountain climbing equipment and scale that facade there. But as you say, getting the wine down, I mean, goodness. But when he opened the cellar, I mean, it was an unbelievable sight, right?
Yeah, he said he opened the door and it sparkled. The whole place just caught the bit of the light from outside, and it was as though it was Aladdin's cave filled with jewels. Well, it was filled with jewels, but they were liquid jewels in this case.
Absolutely. But, how do you think you would get thousands of bottles, well, millions of bottles down from such a place? There were no roads up there. There was no way to transport by truck, the millions of cases of wine that had been hidden there and in various chalets in the vicinity. How would they do it? Well,
here's how.
Yeah.
Who else?
Those are ambulance workers, and they came armed with hospital stretchers, and they hiked up and loaded the stretchers with case after case, and walked it all down the side of the mountain.
Well, while they were doing that, the guys left down below were emptying out the tanks, taking out everything that was unessential in the tanks, all the equipment, whatever else they had. And so that when Bernard came down with the first load, he turned to the other stretcher bearers and said, "Fill her up." And they did.
And they did, right. So anyway, you can imagine the parties that were held down there. I mean, these were the most wonderful wines that, you know, France has ever produced. And they were able to drink it. They were able to sample anything they wanted. I imagine the parties that unfolded there. But those are the French, and they got there. They beat the Americans.
I don't think they probably checked too much on the vintage, but there were some that Denoncourt immediately noticed. It was the very champagne he'd seen being taken by the Germans from a champagne house across the street from where he was working when he was just a teenager. And the pleasure of recuperating those bottles was amazing.
Yeah. You're looking at a happy scene here. We don't have a picture of the Americans, but they were furious. They were incredibly upset that the French had beat them to Berchtesgaden and up to Eagle's Nest. And immediately the guy in charge said, ordered the French to lower their flag and raise the American flag in its place.
Well, they did. Of course, by that time they were happy with the thought that they had gotten there first, and essentially gave a Gaelic shrug and said, "Okay, put up the stars and stripes. It's fine. We've had quite a day, haven't we?" "Yeah," said one of the other officers. "God loves the French."
Anyway, moving a little further ahead.
Yeah, after the war in 1962, for the first time, there were German flags hanging next to the French tricolor on the Champs-Élysées. And even more astonishing, the French president was going to welcome a German head of state for the very first time after the war. It was, of course, an amazing event. And on the day that this happened, Robert Jean de Vogüé and his son, Guylaine, sat down to watch the news on television. But as de Gaulle got ready for the ceremonial handshake, Guylaine hopped up and said, "Oh, Dad, I'll turn this off. You don't want to see this." And Robert Jean de Vogüé put out his arm and stopped his son and said, "No, leave it on, Guylaine. This is what I've worked my whole life to see."
And that's it. A happy ending